Good afternoon, everyone. We are now ready to begin our webinar on equitable and inclusive procurement. Thanks very much for all of you for joining us today for this conversation. Thanks to the Anchor Institutions Task Force's Economic Development Executives subgroup for choosing this theme for the year of equitable and inclusive procurement and employment. Today, we're going to focus specifically on equitable and inclusive procurement. So let's get started and go to our first slide. Just to give a sense of what we're going to do in this hour is we're going to look at a couple of case examples of equitable and inclusive procurement in urban communities by two anchor institutions, the University of Pennsylvania and Rutgers University-Newark. I'm David Morass, giving you this introduction. I am the director of the Anchor Institutions Task Force and the president of MARGA Incorporated. We will then hear from an example from the University of Pennsylvania by Mark Mills, and then we'll hear an example from Rutgers University-Newark by Arcelio Aponte and Kevin Lyons. And then we'll have some Q&A for those of you who are listening in. If you look to the right margin of your screen, you can open up on the orange arrow a group of options, and one of those options is to submit questions. So throughout our time, you can type in questions, which will go straight to our organizer. We'll try to get to some of your questions, but we know we only have an hour, so we will do our best in that regard. Next slide, please. So here you can see us, who we are, who you will be hearing from today. Myself and Mark Mills, the Executive Director of Purchasing Services at University of Pennsylvania, Arcelio Aponte, Senior Vice Chancellor for Administration, Economic Development, and CFO at Rutgers University-Newark, and Kevin Lyons, Associate Professor, Supply Chain Management, Rutgers Business School. Next slide, please. I just want to say a little bit about the Anchor Institutions Task Force. Many of you who are on the line have heard of the task force and are members of the task force. But for those of you who aren't, just to say a little bit about it, the task force is an action-oriented learning community which promotes the engagement of anchor institutions in community and economic development. It was founded in 2009, has over 800 members. Our next annual conference will take place in New York City on November 15th and 16th. The conferences are really an opportunity to hear from representatives of different anchor institutions, to talk about opportunities to improve communities and how to reduce inequities in communities through community partnerships. And there you can see the link to the Anchor Institutions Task Force. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the rationale and the values of the task force. So the task force certainly is, as I mentioned, an action-oriented learning community, an opportunity to bring together people who care about the role that anchor institutions play in their surrounding communities. We really see the task force as a movement organization to bring together those who are really committed to strengthening the role that anchor institutions can play in equitable growth in communities and how to expand access to opportunities for community residents. The task force convenes individuals across sectors. So for us, it's important to make sure that when we think about anchor institutions, which are really enduring organizations that play a vital role in their communities, we're talking about institutions that represent various fields: higher education, healthcare, but many others as well, in government and philanthropy. We want to bring together community organizations. Whoever are the people we think should play some role in strengthening communities, the task force is really about trying to figure out the ways to navigate and create those complex partnerships that are really going to be required if we're going to transform communities. But it's important to say that the task force really is a values-driven organization. So it's not just a matter of bringing people together as anchor institutions to talk about anchor institutions in communities, it's really also about how anchor institutions engage in communities. So you see our core values: a commitment to collaboration and partnership, a commitment to equity and social justice, a commitment to democratic practice, and a commitment to place. Next slide, please. There are subgroups in the task force, and as I mentioned to you, the group that is sponsoring this particular webinar today is called the Economic Development Executives subgroup, but we also have a couple of other subgroups in the task force: higher educational presidents and health professionals. These are peer groups, they are peer-driven groups, they are professional development, they are dues-paying groups that meet periodically throughout the year. The Economic Development Executive Subgroup was the very first subgroup that was created in the task force. It was designed 6 years ago. The participants in this particular group, and you're going to hear from representatives from that group today, they represent different positions in anchor institutions. So who are the people who are responsible for community engagement, particularly those who are involved in some aspect of economic development? And this group, as well as the other subgroups, meet throughout the year. This group chooses to meet by phone 3 times per year and once in person just before the AITF's annual conference in some form of an all-day summit. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about our topic for today. The task force as a whole, as well as the Economic Development Executive Subgroup, has really increasingly been thinking about equity and inclusion. As you saw, equity has been in the values of the Anchor Institutions Task Force from the very beginning. But we know as this work evolves and we think about the next phase of how anchor institutions engage in communities, we know that we're going to have to think more and more about equity and inclusion. We're going to really want to make sure that those populations that have historically been left out, even in economic and community development pursuits that on the surface really appear to be improving the place, we want to make sure that when we think about equity in communities, that we're prioritizing people, not just the physical places. Yes, we want to transform physical places, but we want to pay special attention to particular populations, those populations that have had limited opportunities historically, lower income populations, communities of color, and other institutions, other communities that have been historically disenfranchised, and figure out how to increase how anchor institutions can be inclusive of those populations. So the Economic Development Executive Subgroup identified equitable, inclusive hiring and procurement as the topic for the year. And this particular webinar focuses specifically on procurement. So you're going to hear some examples of intentional efforts to contract with and support local and diverse businesses and engage the local communities in which those businesses are situated. And this particular webinar is going to explore examples from 2 anchor institutions, one which happens to be public, Rutgers University-Newark, and one private, the University of Pennsylvania. And we know that those dynamics are important to consider. These are both institutions that are represented in the subgroup, and they're both going to talk a bit about their equitable and inclusive procurement efforts. Next slide, please. So now we're going to transition to our first speaker, Mark Mills. I just want to say a little bit about Mark Mills, the Executive Director of Purchasing Services at the University of Pennsylvania. In this role, Mark Mills oversees approximately $1 billion in university spend. Mark's team performs a variety of services on behalf of the university, ranging from strategic sourcing, supplier management, procure-to-pay systems management, travel services, and purchasing card administration. Mark joined Penn in 2011, bringing over 20 years of procurement and financial management experience. Prior to Penn, Mark held positions with such firms as Cigna, Johnson & Johnson, Unisys, Bearing Point, and Siemens. Mark Mills.
Hi, David, and thank you. Thanks, everybody, for including me today. It's certainly a pleasure for me to share info on our program. It's one of the things I love about my job and about being at Penn is this value we place on economic inclusion. So not only am I excited to talk about that, but it's even more of a pleasure to learn something from our CLEO and Kevin, who are going to speak later, and perhaps from those joining us. As I go through the slides today, I'm going to touch on our economic inclusion program, including some history, our approach to economic inclusion, and some but not all of the program elements that we've recently put in place that I think are pretty neat and maybe spawn some good ideas with other organizations. So let me start at the top, and we'll go to the next slide. So you see here a quote: "The diversity of our university must reflect the diversity of the world around it and the diversity of the world that we want our students to lead." That comes from our president, Amy Gutmann. And I put that up there because, it really starts at the top at Penn. And I think that's probably quite evident for those that have been part of the Anchor Institution Task Force. Our president has a credo, and it's referred to as the Penn Compact. And it centers on 3 I's, one of which is inclusion, and the other is innovation and impact, which in many ways are interrelated as it comes to diversity and local procurement. But I think it's important to recognize the fact that inclusion and diversity are such a big part of that, a big part of the culture at Penn. But it isn't new. So let's go to the next slide. So we go back, when we think about economic inclusion at Penn, it probably precedes this, but formally we go back decades to 1986. Penn launched the Buy West Philadelphia program, and this was part of a larger effort to connect Penn to its neighborhood. And the Buy West Philadelphia program was intended to do just that. It was a campaign around making sure we buy locally. Now that started, as you can tell, geographically based, but over the years, and I'm not going to go through each point, but over the years, it's formally added diversity into the mix because we have such a diverse neighborhood, and diversity is so important in general. But it's also included peers in our discussions and outreach, and we've formalized certain aspects of the program. And as we get to today, we're at a point where we have a diversity in local supplier spend impact of each exceeding $100 million annually. And when we look at our catalog suppliers and what we call the Penn Marketplace, so the Penn Marketplace is sort of an online portal where you can buy anything from office supplies to temp staffing services to lab supplies, whatever it might be. Of those catalog suppliers in the Penn Marketplace, 34% of those are either diversity or local suppliers as of our last count. We've also formalized a purchasing subcommittee, which is in place and engaging on a regular basis with internal and external partners. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. And we can go to the next slide. So we really have a few foundational pillars that we work around. One is community engagement. We're participating very often in regular events and forums to make sure we're staying connected with the community and our supply market. One of the things I love is that I'll be out and about at an event or something like that, and somebody will say, "Hey, have you heard of this supplier in West Philadelphia?" And almost invariably, I and my team are like, "Yep, we know them, we've met with them." By being out and about, we really get that understanding of our market. As part of that, key to what we do is partnerships, working with not only the external partners at our minority chambers of commerce, the University City District, and others. We work with our internal partners, the Netter Center for Community Development, I'm sorry, Corey's going to kill me, he's on the line, but the Netter Center for Community Partnerships, and others, the Wharton Small Business Development Center, and many more. And we're going to talk about that in a couple slides as well. But we work closely with them to make sure we're keeping that heartbeat. We actively promote suppliers. And again, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but between our systems and the activities that we do, we are actively promoting local and diversity suppliers, not just getting them on board and hoping they do well. We're actively promoting. And then core to everything is goal setting, measuring, and reporting. So making sure we have the metrics and are being held accountable to goals and reporting and reporting out to the community about those. And we can move to the next slide. So I always like to talk about the what's of the Purchasing Services Economic Inclusion Program, because I think it helps dispel some myths. So, I like to start with what we don't do. We don't set strict central quotas on diversity supplier spend. And before anybody reacts to that, I'll be addressing what we do in a second. But we don't automatically add local and diversity suppliers to bid lists regardless of their capabilities. And we don't set out to pay a premium for diversity. But what we do is we measure diversity in local spend activity. With that, we set goals and share outcomes. And most importantly, we work harder for our economic inclusion suppliers, that being diverse and local suppliers. That is by proactively identifying who those suppliers are, getting them on our radar, including them in the local and diversity suppliers wherever possible in bidding events, and then supporting and promoting the high-performing local and diversity suppliers. Now, I want to go back to a point because this comes up a lot in Q&A, and that is that point about setting out to pay a premium for diversity. We work off of kind of a best value approach, and to say that we would never pay a nickel more for diversity or local, we would. It's just that we don't set out and say, hey, we're willing to go 10% higher here or 15% higher there. We're lucky. We have a lot of really great diversity suppliers and local suppliers here in West Philadelphia. So we like to have everything competed in kind of an open way. So we find that we've been successful with that, but we don't necessarily have a scoring metric that says we're going to pay a premium in this area. So I just wanted to make that clear. All right, we can go to the next slide. Like I talked about, relationships are huge for us. So we work regularly with a lot of organizations that I've already mentioned that share our goals. So here you see a whole bunch of logos, and they represent those organizations that in one way or another are helping us to advance diversity in local purchasing. So you can see a whole smattering of them. And I'm going to talk about these as we go forward in the next slides, but it's really important for us when we talk about how we're identifying suppliers, how we're planning events, how we're knowing our market. We're depending on all these great relationships to help us do that. Even with developing suppliers, we're really looking to these organizations in varying ways to help with that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slides as well. Next slide, please. Core to what we do is the formal establishment of our Procurement Working Committee for Economic Inclusion. I've mentioned this because it's part of kind of the structure of what we do. All but I think one of the organizations you saw on the previous slide are part of this Working Committee for Economic Inclusion. And it's really critical to help us stay close and even to hold us account to the work that we're doing. So some of the things that we do, as I said, the members from those, our representatives from each of those organizations includes internal and external. And this was organized as part of we have what's kind of an overarching economic inclusion plenary committee at Penn. And what that is it's hosted by our Office of Government Community Affairs. And that really is set out with internal and external partners, it's set out to basically oversee what we're doing from a construction standpoint, a workforce standpoint, and a procurement standpoint. And within each of those, we have subcommittees. And our subcommittee is the Procurement Working Committee for Economic Inclusion. So we do meet regularly, and somebody might say, oh, that's great, you meet, what do you do? Well, we do the following. We have activity updates from each of the member organizations, so we're all keeping a beat on what each other are doing. We're sharing our local and diversity impact update. When I talk about being held to account, we're sharing literally the numbers for what we did year to date or for the year in each of the diversity subcategories, what we did locally, and any detail around that the member organizations are asking us. We're also doing a sourcing pipeline review and discussion. And one point that I probably should have made it earlier, is that from a central standpoint, our team, Purchasing Services at Penn, doesn't necessarily buy on a daily basis. We don't get things for Penn. But what we do is we do manage the large contracts. So our travel services contracts, our temp staffing contracts, our lab supplies contracts, office supplies, promotional goods, all print supplies, all these things that are big contracts that we make accessible to the university are sourced through our group. And then on a decentralized fashion, the schools and centers, the administrators across the university actually do the buying. But when we're doing so going back to that third sub-bullet, when we're meeting with our subcommittee, we're looking at the central sourcing pipeline of the big projects that are coming up so that they can have an idea of what's coming up and where maybe their members, maybe it's a minority chamber of commerce, and they know they have a great supplier in a certain category, they can get us that information if they haven't already. So we think that's surely a critical piece of what the committee meetings are for. And then a big part of what we do is simply events planning. I'm going to talk about one of the major events that we've recently put in place in a moment, but not just events planning from our standpoint, but from the partner standpoint. It's kind of fun to hear each of the organizations getting involved in everybody else's projects. So that's one of the neat things that we do as a subcommittee. All right, next slide. So one of the really cool things about being part of higher ed is the proximity we have to extremely smart and ambitious students and faculty. And as a quick shout out, I mentioned him earlier, but Corey Bowman from the Netter Center for Community Partnerships. When I joined Penn, I was talking to Corey on a soccer field, and he got talking about the Wharton Field Application Project. And what that is it's an actual course, Management 653. It's offered within the MBA program at Wharton, and it basically allows students to apply their knowledge and wisdom to community businesses and other organizations. So following Corey's introduction with the program, we've been really lucky to engage students in a few areas that you see noted on the slide: economic inclusion program improvement, our catering and food strategy, and other specific kind of supplier development opportunities. The first one is particularly pertinent to today's discussion because we did have a student team look really critically at Purchasing Services' own economic inclusion program, and it was really fun. Of course, you have to have some thick skin as they tell you all the things that you could be doing more, but they had some really great advice on the things that we could be doing. And part of their feedback, one of the things that kind of rang true was, hey, the effort's strong in what we do. Our systems are pretty good. We actually made some improvements to some of the web features that we have as a result of that. But one of the big things they said was we really could do more to connect buyers to suppliers, which is hard at a big institution like ours. We have a lot of rules around you can't blast emails and things like that. It's kind of hard to market within Penn other than kind of through kind of warm networks and things. So we really gave that a lot of thought. And the student team, they didn't tell us what to do, but they did make us think. And we've done a couple of really cool things, I think, since then. And I'm going to close on those. I'm going to speak to those and close on that. But I want to kind of speak to how they've developed. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the first one. So connecting buyers and suppliers, to that point, one of the first things we did was as I was jotting when they were talking about our program, I said, wait a minute, we have this thing called the Association of Business Administrators. We call it the ABA. They meet on a regular basis, and the business administrators, among other many things that they do at Penn, are often the buyers at Penn. So we have very approximately about 1,500 different buyers at Penn, and about 100 plus meet on a regular basis, all from varying schools and centers, to talk about stuff. And some of it's frankly a little dry, so like payroll and tax changes and things like that. And one of the things we said was, boy, wouldn't it be neat? They're always trying to get people to meeting with donuts and coffee or pretzels and water, depending on the time of the day. And we said, well, wouldn't it be neat if we could kind of sponsor the meetings and either a supplier with Purchasing Services provide the donuts and coffee or whatever it might be in exchange for a local or diversity supplier getting 15 to 20 minutes of the floor to talk about their business with these administrators. So that's exactly what we did. We went out and we started this a few years ago. And we said, all right, let's start bringing local and diversity suppliers that can be as applicable to as many different groups as possible to that meeting. And it's been really tremendously successful. We've had, as you can see here, the logos you see on the screen are some of the companies that have presented at the ABA. Not all of the companies, but this is really important to us. A few things this did. Going back to that point, it helped connect suppliers to buyers, and it kind of extended some goodwill to the local suppliers. But also it gives us the chance to kind of emphasize in this decentralized environment just the cultural, organizational importance of local and diversity purchasing. So it kind of keeps beating that drum, which we think is really important at Penn because it is part of our knitting. So that was one thing that we did, which has been successful. In fact, I'm going to add one little anecdote to that. And this was just something we had heard from hearsay. There was somebody overheard on the train. We have a lot of people who commute by train. Somebody was overheard saying that they were going to take the day off, but they heard that there was a diversity supplier spotlight at the ABA and decided they were actually going to work that day because they wanted to come see that. So I thought that was a really cool testament to the success of the program. All right, let's go to the next slide. One of the next big things we wanted to do, and this kind of is a way of bringing suppliers and buyers together in somewhat of a more epically fun way. Although the ABA program is really fun, but a while back we'd started off with an enjoyable and effective networking event that we'd kind of done internally in purchasing services. But we said, you know what, let's do something a little bit bigger. So we expanded that collaboration to others at the university to create a bigger event. And in 2017, we hosted our first Penn Supplier Diversity Forum and Expo. And that was put in place not only to connect buyers and suppliers, but also to showcase our diversity suppliers, the resource organizations with which we work, those logos, the aforementioned organizations. And also we just wanted to celebrate diversity. We just wanted to make sure we had an event that really kind of said, we're proud of this. We're proud of the fact that at Penn, we have so many great suppliers that are from West Philadelphia, from all these great diversity classifications. So I'm going to get further into the details of it, but it was basically structured to have a forum, which was a public discussion, an indoor forum that would be have a panel discussion with a preceding poster session, but then followed by a big expo outside. And I'm going to share some pictures and talk a little bit more in detail. But the first event that we had in 2017 was a really great success, and we were really proud to have gotten the Edwin R. Golden Award for Inclusive Excellence from the National Association of College Auxiliary Services. It was just a really great moment for Penn to be able to say, hey, you know what, this was really well recognized. But let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk about the event itself. So prior to our forum, we set out about a half an hour. This was partly for crowd control, but mostly to get people to mingle, network, and learn more about the organizations with which we work. So you see here posters from each of our resource organizations, and you'll see that they all look kind of similar, but really nice. So we had a design firm work with Minority Business Development Agency, the Wharton Small Business Development Center, the Minority Chambers of Commerce, the University City District, the Netter Center, and others to create these posters that all have a similar look but different really cool content. And at each one, you know, they got to hang out by their poster and talk about their organization and how it's helping Penn and how it's helping the area. So we thought that was just a lot of fun and a great way to get people talking, and also a great way to just kind of precede the forum. One of the things I really thought was cool is in our subcommittee meeting prior to the last the 2018 event, one of the chambers had said to us, oh, we don't even need a new poster. We have the one from last year. The info is pretty much the same. It's actually up in our office because we love the poster so much. So we're really pleased that it's had that traction and it's had that value to the organizations. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the forum. So these are some pictures from our forum, and really that's what we were doing. We were leading a public discussion on economic inclusion. The event was moderated, if you look at that top right picture to the far left of the panel, moderated by our wonderful EVP, Craig Carnaroli, with a diverse set of panelists. So if I go left to right, and I do want to talk about who they are and what they do, just to give a sense for who was kind of leading this discussion. But Celeste Corrado is the woman on to Craig's left. She is the director of the Wharton Small Business Development Center. Gave great perspective on what they are doing to help local and small businesses. Harold Epps, to her left, our right, he is the director of commerce for the city of Philadelphia, and importantly, he's also a co-lead for our Anchor Procurement Initiative. The Anchor Procurement Initiative is a city-based initiative to bring our anchor institutions together to keep that conversation going on what we can be doing and learning from each other when it comes to procurement. The other part of the hosting of that is from the Economy League and Jeff Hornstein, who's over the Economy League. And this is a wonderful group that gets together, and we're really pleased to have them at the lead because we've already started to make some great impact in the area on that. The next person, as we move to our right, is Lynn Thomas, who's the CEO of a company called EMSCO Supra, which is a neighborhood-based West Philadelphia African-American-owned supplier that's doing some really neat things with Penn in the area of lab supplies. And he had a lot of great perspective to share as kind of a veteran supplier in the area who's really seen a lot over the years. And then lastly, on the far right, is a gentleman by the name of Evan Urbania, who's the CEO of a company called Chatterblast. He represents the LGBT community, as his firm does, as far as LGBT-owned businesses. And they're a young emerging supplier who's gotten into Penn and gotten a foot in the door through our decentralized process, not through a central sourcing event, and really talked well to how to kind of navigate in a big organization when there's not like a huge central push for something. So again, great perspective. Each of these panelists brought great perspective to important questions that we had prepared and that came from audience Q&A. And I was really pleased we had a wonderfully diverse audience that included Penn staff, Penn suppliers, prospective suppliers, our partner organizations, and others. So it was really great to have hundreds of people in the crowd listening to this great discussion. So that concluded, and we all went outside to enjoy the expo. So this forum took place from 11 to 12, and then from noon to 2, we had a Supplier Diversity Expo, which included dozens of our tremendous suppliers. And let's go to the next slide. So here you see pictures from the expo, and we wanted to have this outside because we just wanted to make it fun. We wanted to make it engaging. We wanted to have a walk-up crowd if we could, even though we had a registration process. But we had a wide range of suppliers. Of course, everybody loved the food, and you can see kind of pre-event, I think that was High Point that had set up a great spread. Others did as well. But we wanted this to be engaging. We wanted it to be meaningful, and this was the chance for suppliers to do their meet and greet and engage with their existing customers, their prospective customers, and also to learn more about support organizations. So like the Enterprise Center and Wharton Small Business Development Center, the Netter Center, our University City District, the Minority Chambers. But one of the other things I think it gave our suppliers a chance to do is engage with each other. I think one of the neat things, it's always neat to hear about our staff members coming out and saying, hey, I got a business card from this one printer and I'm going to use them for my next job. But we also hear these great stories of, I was next door to the following and I'm now going to be using them for my catering for the next event or whatever it might be. We find that that's always really, really fulfilling for us. But I'm closing on this slide, and I bring this up because it was really a true collaboration. I think if there's one thing that I want to emphasize is the importance for us to collaborate. So when we did this, we got together with the Office of the EVP, the Office of the President, the Office of Government and Community Affairs, the Office of Affirmative Action, and importantly, each of these aforementioned business and community support organizations, as well as our suppliers, to pull off something that would be meaningful. And we couldn't have pulled off this event as just a department. So we're really thankful for the fact that we can kind of do this at Penn. I hope every other organization can do that as well, but we're really thankful for that and kind of proud of that. But one other thing I want to say before I complete my slides is that we know we can be doing a lot more. It's still hard to do business at Penn. It can be hard to do business at Penn. There's a lot of questions that people have. We haven't probably fully optimized. We certainly haven't fully optimized kind of every category and how we're utilizing local and diverse suppliers. So we know there's a lot more work to do. But our hope is to kind of keep moving that needle forward, to kind of find that next thing. That's where I like to learn from. We're going to learn from the next presenters, but others to see what else we can be doing, and also to be, keep the conversation going. We talked about the Anchor Procurement Initiative, the involvement with our subcommittee. We just want to keep that conversation going so that we're learning as much as we can, and like I said, moving that needle forward. So I look forward to Q&A, and that completes my slides. So David, I guess we'll hand it off.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's great to hear from you, and I really appreciate the comprehensiveness of Penn's approach to this work. And sounds like Penn has been thinking about economic inclusion for quite some time, but yet, as you mentioned, you're continuing to grow and continuing to evolve. So I really appreciate your walking us through the evolution of this work and where it stands right now. So now we're going to move to Rutgers University-Newark, and we're going to have two presenters. I'll just say a little bit about both presenters, and then we'll start with Arcelio and then Kevin. Arcelio Aponte is the Senior Vice Chancellor for Administration, Economic Development, and the Chief Financial Officer for Rutgers University-Newark. In this position, he manages the university's annual operating budget and financial transactions. Before joining Rutgers University-Newark, Arcelio served as Director of Operations and Management for Economic and Housing Development in the city of Newark. Arcelio is also the President of the New Jersey State Board of Education. And then Kevin Lyons. Kevin Lyons is an associate professor of supply chain management at Rutgers Business School. His research includes the integration of sustainable development and diversity criteria into local and supply chain management and manufacturing systems, processes, and operations. Dr. Lyons is the principal investigator for the Newark Manufacturing and Industrial Solutions Center Research Project, the Newark Anchor Institution Research Institute, the Newark Urban Agriculture Project, and the U.S. State Department Mandela Washington Fellows Program. Previously, Dr. Lyons was the Chief Procurement Officer at Rutgers. So now first we'll hear from Arcelio Aponte.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me say, Mark, great presentations, really exciting work at UPenn. On behalf of Rutgers University-Newark and our Chancellor, Dr. Nancy Cantor, I would like to thank David for coordinating this webinar and providing us the opportunity to share with you some of our anchor work at Rutgers University-Newark. I'll begin with just a very brief overview of our procurement operations and then turn the discussion over to our esteemed professor, Kevin Lyons, who has been the lead strategist on the citywide buy local initiative, and his presentation will focus on the citywide efforts. The University Procurement Enterprise System was overhauled about a year ago. The need for the overhaul was driven by the merger of Rutgers University with the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, which occurred about 5 or 6 years ago, and the recognition that accurate and useful procurement data and information was difficult, if not impossible, to obtain from the legacy system. Without getting into the details of the implementation of the new university central system, which was led locally by our Director of Procurement, Ida Angelone, it was important for us to have a high level of confidence and reliability in our procurement data and internal operations and maintain credibility with our local vendors. The new system allows us to be accurate and efficient in reporting on local procurement and making accurate payments to vendors in a timely manner. Having these internal capabilities and systems in place was essential to be able to effectively position a university as a lead anchor on the citywide initiative. I'll pause here and turn the discussion over to Dr. Lyons to present on his work on our local procurement efforts. So, Dr. Lyons?
Thank you, Arcelio, and thank you, David. And Mark, again, great presentation. I spent a lot of time in my history down at UPenn working with you guys, so you guys continue to do great work. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So as Arcelio says, I'm going to talk about the Anchor Institution Initiative, but under the Rutgers University umbrella. So I'll be talking about both at the same time. So next slide. So what we have to look at when we're thinking about our buy local or local procurement anchor strategy is, taking into account the history of the city of Newark, the many, many different types of reports that were done on productivity. The one picture that you see on this slide was commissioned by Mayor Cory Booker back when he was the mayor of Newark to look at why Newark's manufacturing sector was not as productive as the rest of the country. So there's a lot of history about this concept of why our diverse and local businesses are not performing optimally. And my work in procurement, as well as this anchor project, is to weave all that history into what we're going to be presenting to you now. So next slide. So what I'm going to talk about is the Newark 2020 project. It is a vision by the current mayor of Newark, Mayor Ross Baraka, to weave together the concept of buying local with hiring local, hiring our local residents, and to get folks to consider and increase the amount of people who actually live in Newark as well. And with this strategy, we feel that we can build an inclusive procurement program that touches everyone's life, as well as build our economic development. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that got us to the place where we are right now. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about are things that I wasn't able to do as a chief procurement officer, spend more time out in the field building capacity and working with our local manufacturers and businesses to get them to the point where they are viable to be contracted locally. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the system that we built. So obviously, once you get all that data, then you have to put it someplace and make it accessible, not only to our Rutgers University procurement professionals, but I built a system that's good for all the anchor institutions within Newark. So next slide. So the overarching goals for this project, as you see here on the slide, is 6 goals. And what we want to do is we want to actually try our best to be as innovative as possible and improve productivity of our suppliers at the same time. So we are working with a very good diverse pool of suppliers, women-owned and minority-owned businesses, as well as other small businesses, but we need to find a way, and we have to build their capacity so that they can not only do business with our anchor institutions and Rutgers here in Newark, but also make them viable for others outside the region to do business with them as well. And with that, we can build the local economy. So we're looking at that. We're looking at sustainability as part of our package as well, connecting our manufacturers to other new markets, looking at the workforce and what's the next generation of technology and education needed to be working in these sectors, and to build the next generation of pipelines. With all of that, we feel that we can have an impact on the economic outlook of the city. Next slide. So I wanted to give you just a quick snapshot of what we're dealing with, so this way you get a better idea of why we took the approach that we have. So we did a lot of comparative analysis of the region. We looked at the county, we looked at incomes, we looked at the Newark's incomes, we looked at the unfortunate number, which I think is going down, of our unemployment rate in Newark, the labor force. We looked at manufacturing, which happens to be one of the largest sectors of business in Newark. So there's 400 operating manufacturers in the city of Newark, employing about 6,800 people. And the average salary, as you can see, for manufacturers is much higher than the average salary for Newark residents. So, you know, you're going to see a lot of what I'm doing that's mixing both the diverse manufacturers that we have in Newark, but also the diverse businesses that we do business with as well. So next slide. And this is just a quick snapshot of what the region looks like. So again, as a researcher, you know, moving from being the chief procurement officer, I now have to focus a lot more on data and information. So I just wanted to share with you what the actual region looks like. So manufacturing and business in this region is very vibrant. And what we want to do is put Newark in a position to be a part of that booming economy. Next slide. So I also wanted to show you and share with you the types of business that we have in the sector. So it covers every single sector that we have, everything from biotech, as you can see, to textiles, food, chemicals. So when you look at the supply base, it is diverse, it is wide-ranging, and it pretty much covers every sector. So on the surface, you can see that there should not be a problem sourcing local. But when you see on our next slide, we have an issue when it comes to purchasing goods and services locally. So in our research, not only with Rutgers, but other entities that we brought in to do research with us, we found out that out of all of the major institutions that are in Newark, large institutions, so that's Rutgers University, that's the Port, that's the Prudentials and the United Airlines, these are large corporate entities. Out of all their procurement, they're only at this point, or up to the point where we started this project, only purchasing about 3% of what they need to buy goods and services from the city of Newark. My research shows that the capacity for these large institutions to buy locally is 40%. So with that growth and that huge economic development potential is what stands behind the project that I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of my slides. So you have a buy local strategy. We have a goal that is to go from 3% procurement to 20% by the year 2020. And we are on that pathway now. We started the program officially in 2017, June 2017. And by what I'm going to show you in the next remaining couple of slides, we went from 3% to to where we're now sitting at 9% as a city. And as Rutgers University, who is actually doing quite well, we had a local purchasing number before we got started with this project at 21%. So 21% of the university's procurement activity was targeted at local suppliers. And our goal as an institution is to go from 21% to 30% by the year 2020. Next slide. So not to get too wonky on you, but there was a process by which I went through to get us here. So in 2011, which predates this Newark 2020 project, I started an initiative to do research based on that Cory Booker report on manufacturing and business and why they weren't competitive. And we spent 2 years physically going out into the field and visiting every single supplier, looking at their financials, looking at their workforce capacity, looking at their output, and finding out what was keeping them from being competitive and why weren't they a viable supplier to not only Rutgers University, but all the other anchor institutions in Newark. So in 2011, I launched a study and did comprehensive data collection and built a database to support that. So now we have a comprehensive database that has all of our suppliers and our manufacturers in one place, and which shows all of what they have as far as their commodities, the numbers of employees that they have, their financial inputs and outputs, and what we need to do as far as building their capacity to get them to the level where they can be a viable supplier, not only to Rutgers University, but to all the other anchor institutions that are in our network in Newark. So this is a lot of work that went into this. I equally spent about a year and a half on research on our anchor institutions as well. So that's looking at Rutgers University and our procurement processes, but also going into places like Prudential and Audible and United Airlines and all the other anchors that I mentioned, and looking at their procurement processes to figure out what are they doing in order to help build this local, buy local strategy. And in 2016, we purposely started the process of matchmaking our anchor institutions with our local suppliers. Next slide. So these are the companies that I mentioned. We have, out of Newark, there's approximately 30 anchor institutions, but we created what we're calling a Newark Anchor Collaborative. So that's a subset of all 30, and I am working with each one of their procurement operations, again, including Rutgers as our top one, since that's where I work. And then looking at, as I mentioned before, matching them with, and very purposely as well. So I'm out in the field looking at suppliers, looking at their capabilities, and at the same time understanding what our anchor institutions' purchasing patterns are and their contract cycles, and then introducing them to their anchor partners, and then working all the way through the entire process until we get to a contract. And that's the reason why I can report on this 3% to 9% jump. Next slide. So in addition to procurement, I'm also tracking employment. So we're calling this indirect hiring. So as we start to contract locally, we're asking purposely the suppliers, as a result of these contracts that have been issued, have they been able to, or are they in the process of hiring new people because of the capacity growth? So we're not only tracking the procurement dollars, but we're also looking at how this is impacting our local hiring strategy as well. Next slide. So we can flip through these real quickly, but these are just some snapshots of me spending time out in the field working with our suppliers. The last one there is Tisha. She is a baker, and I'm working on a contract right now to get her to produce the little snacks that go on your flights in United Airlines. So again, when I mentioned building capacity and purposely looking for contracts, we're actually in the field working with our suppliers to get them to the place where they can be in order to actually lay in that contract. Next slide. And here's one of our premier suppliers where we took him from a handful of suppliers and where he was sourcing his materials from China. I built his capacity to the point where he was able to land a major contract with a local hospital in Newark, increased his staff from 6 to 15, and now he's able to source his materials from Newark and all of his product is being locally manufactured. And as the verbiage on this slide says, we are now negotiating an expansion of his contract to all 11 hospital systems throughout the state of New Jersey. Next slide. These are just some pictures of his operation. So we actually sourced his equipment as well. So we spent quite a bit of time on eBay and other places actually getting him the equipment needed to actually build his capacity. Next slide. And these are the medical stocks for the hospital. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to conclude with the last 3 slides. This is the system that I designed and built for this project. So behind this, this is a Google Maps application that we merged with all of that data that I collected as part of my field work. So basically, it's a matchmaking process that looks at local anchors, looks at local suppliers, and matchmakes them purposely through a computer program that I created. So this is just an example. You can click through quickly, but basically this is Newark Hospital who's in need of sourcing textiles, and the system basically purposely looks at where they're currently getting their supply from, and then looks for local suppliers that can match that need. So this basically is showing that they're getting their supplies, most of it outside of the region, and the system is designed to not only look at what's available in Newark. Those fancy colors that you see are different cities in the city of in the state of New Jersey, and in the purple is basically showing the system that or the buyer that you have a lot of capacity right here in Newark. Next click. Okay, so in this scenario, it shows that you have the capacity to get all of your textiles locally, and with this system, they were able to negotiate out of their contracts that were getting outside of the region, and now they're actually getting their supplies within Newark. So again, as all of us know, data is very important, but good data that shows good purposeful rationale for why you should be doing local procurement is even better. And I believe that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Okay.
Kevin, and thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Arcelio. Thanks for that very thoughtful presentation on Rutgers University-Newark. It was very contextual in the sense that it's not really just about Rutgers University-Newark, how you work with other anchors in Newark, as well as how you think about the region and you think about the various industries in the region. So it was very useful to hear that broader context, and also useful to hear about your approach to capacity building. Thinking about both of your presentations, the University of Pennsylvania and Rutgers University Newark, both of you emphasized goal setting. And I'm curious about, just to move to our Q&A, I'm curious about just what goes into setting those goals, particularly as you consider some of the barriers to this work. So I'm wondering if both Penn as well as Rutgers Newark could just say a little bit about what are some of the major barriers that you've experienced as you think about identifying, securing, and sustaining local and diverse contractors. So Mark, you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that comes up a lot, I hate to use the word too often, is the decentralization piece of it. And just doing everything we can to create awareness. We have a tough time mandating anything. We do a nice job of kind of organically creating an environment where people can buy diverse and local, but there's still that decentralization that I wouldn't call it a barrier, but it just creates a challenge to traction on certain things. I think, one of the barriers I think we've overcome is that, and I shouldn't say overcome because there's still a lot more to do. I love what Arcelio and Kevin had shown on kind of the matchmaking piece of it, and kind of looking at what could kind of be the market in the area, and doing and thinking through how to matchmake. I think that's one of the biggest things is connecting the demand to the supply and doing that as best as you can. I think huge part of that is those relationships. So in terms of barriers, I'd say, people shouldn't let there be any barriers between them and the market, and use community partners, the minority chambers, the other business development organizations to help kind of bridge that. So I think that's really important. But I love the idea of studying it even further to find out, where we're kind of missing pieces. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Thank you very much. Rutgers folks, any comments on barriers?
Well, I'll just begin, and Kevin can certainly add to the discussion as well. I just wanted to point out that for us, initially, the problem was having confidence in our internal data and being able to unpack that data so we could be more analytical about our procurement in terms of capital procurement as opposed to operational procurement. And again, with the implementation of the new system, we were able to get a lot more detailed information, and that information has helped us and certainly Kevin's work to identify where our current level of procurement is locally, and it allowed us to set reasonable goals by 2020, as Kevin pointed out. So, Kevin, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think Mark and Arcilio pretty much wrapped it up, but the most important thing for us, and this happened a lot when I was in procurement as well, is that procurement is definitely an important piece to all of what we're talking about, but communicating to the folks that requisition or buy stuff is really critical as well, because by the time it gets to procurement, most of the departments have already made up their minds that this is what they want, and for us to then, unilaterally change whatever it is that they said that they wanted to what we believe is in their best interest is almost asking for a fight. So we need to spend more time educating the nurses and the business managers and the people who are in the field who need the goods and services, and they should be asking for, if we do our communications right, by the time it gets to the procurement folks, that they have already asked for us to do the diverse local options for them, and then it becomes much more acceptable and easier for us to do our jobs.
Kevin, while you have the floor, I have a question from the audience that I think is a good fit for you. You talked a lot about working with other anchor institutions in Newark. How did you get those other institutions to share their procurement and employment information?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it always comes up. And how I was able to get them. Now, the interesting thing about procurement professionals, and Mark is definitely one of them, is that procurement people like other procurement people. And so they knew that, my former life, I was in charge of procurement at the university, and I understood exactly what their day-to-day processes were like. So I just didn't go in there and say, give me all this data. There was a meaningful conversation about, collaborative purchasing. There was a meaningful dialogue about processes. And each one of these anchor institutions all have different ways of doing procurement. So I was able to easily understand their day-to-day operations, and what I was giving them was a value add, which was, I can bring you highly qualified local suppliers that have been vetted through the process. So very rarely do you have an entity or a procurement person who basically is spending their time working with their supply base to get them to the place where they want to be. And with that opened up the doors for us to have this data sharing, and for me to work very closely with these anchor institutions. So it's about relationship building, as we always talk about in procurement, and that happened at the procurement level as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. We only have a couple minutes left, and I'm wondering if each of you could just give some closing remarks. And if you could think about in those closing remarks, if you could say a little bit of advisory words, some word of guidance for those who might be in earlier stages of developing a procurement strategy, what would you suggest they prioritize as they move forward? So let's start with Mark.
So, Kevin just made a great point. One of the things I love about higher ed is the fact that peers are so open with information and interested in sharing best practices as well as data and things like that. So I think that's a really important piece to it. But, going back to the barriers and that important point that was made, getting an idea of the data is critical. I think, almost as a first step, getting an idea of what your data looks like and being able to set some goals, I think is really critical. I also think you need to make sure you have organizational buy-in, and hopefully everybody on the line has that. That's one of the things I think is great about, it sounds like what Rutgers is doing, what Penn is doing, a lot of our peers. It's that organizational buy-in that makes collaboration easy within. So I think that's really important. And then, I hear at seminars and things like that people get stuck on things that maybe they shouldn't get stuck on. One of the topics was supplier development. What is purchasing doing to develop suppliers? Well, some might be doing a lot, but we're fortunate to have the Enterprise Center. We're fortunate to have a small business development center locally. We're fortunate to have all these resources available. Learn what those resources are and build those relationships so that they can kind of help, I don't want to say do work for you as a procurement organization, but help kind of complement everything you're doing to advance economic inclusion. I think that's a really critical piece.
Thanks, Arcilio.
I would just mention what Mark already mentioned. Actually, is the data. Having great data is important to understand where you are today before setting goals for tomorrow. I'll yield to Kevin for the last comment.
Okay, so real quickly, I'll second everything Arcilio and Mark says, but two quick things. I know it's very hard with our busy lives, but spending time out in the field, like we used to do way back when we first started procurement, is critical. Those suppliers, when they look at you and you show up and you speak to them in person, they really open up and feel comfortable that you have made the attempt to come visit them. And then lastly, we started a program where we're now placing interns or business school interns in diverse suppliers as a internship, working on behalf of the anchors. So this way we are now starting to educate the next generation of procurement professionals. So I think that's critically important as well.
Great. Thank you, Mark and Arcilio and Kevin, for your wisdom. We really appreciate all that you have shared with us today. Thanks to all of our listeners. We will make a recording of this session available. And with that, we will sign off now. And thanks again for your attention and your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.